Mm, mm, mm. And this is the prediction in the Buddhist sutras that the next Buddha is society. It's a societal Buddha. So we have to wake up as a community. It's not an individual, it's not a savior anymore. Buddha Shakyamuni and Christ and Muhammad, that was a different time. The world was completely different then. The ancient world. And the world needed individuals like that. Now we're so connected and disconnected that we need societies to wake up, families to wake up, nations to wake up, towns to wake up. The world is too noisy for it to be one person.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to Unbroken Chain. I am Mara James, and this week we are hanging out with Dr. Shante Paradigm Smalls. This conversation is such an offering. You're basically in for a Dharma talk on the nature of suffering, particularly in what Dr. Smalls calls America's culture of forgetfulness. And aside from this being just a really thoughtful, deep reflection on what it means to be a human, particularly right now at this time in our species' history, it also contains, I think, a lot of really concrete tools. You know, my favorite kind of person right here in terms of how to work with the circumstances that we find ourselves in and how to be and manifest the kind of qualities and presence that we value and that are needed. So Dr. Smalls, who uses they, them, and their pronouns, is currently living in Georgia, in Atlanta. They're here on a fellowship at the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference at Emory University. But normally they can be found in Brooklyn. They're an assistant professor of Black literature and culture at St. John's University in Queens. And in addition to that, they teach Dharma meditation in the Buddhist tradition of the Shambhala school of Tibetan Buddhism. They have been a meditation instructor since 2015 after many, many years of training. And I think you will hear that practice really deeply informing their perspective and the way that they communicate, which I so value. Some of you may have heard Shambhala has been in and out of the news over the last year or so because of some Me Too-esque movements happening in that school. And we don't get into that. If you want to, you can read more about that. And actually, I'm speaking to a friend a little bit later on the podcast who's also in Shambhala and speaks more specifically to that. But I will say that I'm aware of it, Dr. Smalls is aware of it, and you can find more about that on Dr. Smalls' website if you're interested in their perspective on how to hold that. I also wanted to say that there are several podcasts linked on Dr. Smalls' website. I've really enjoyed listening to many of them, including several Dharma talks. They also have a podcast of their own coming out soon called Fantastic Blackness, and a book that they're finishing editing right now, you'll hear them mention it, which is called Hip Hop Heresies, Queer Aesthetics in New York City. So there's a lot to look out for from Dr. Smalls coming up. Buckle up. I'm really glad you're here with us, and enjoy.
I feel like you have a really interesting combination of academic practice and then you have the meditation and Dharma practice. And I'm curious where those intersect for you.
It's a good question, and it's kind of been a contemplation for me the last few years, in part because they both can really take over like one's or my life. And I think one of the things I'm sort of moving toward is actually doing more scholarly work around the Dharma. So actually I'm going to be doing a special issue with a journal called The Arrow, which is a journal of, I think I forgot the subtitle, it's like Culture, Politics, and Wakeful Society or something like that. So we're going to be doing going to be editing a special issue on Blackness and Dharma. And so I'm really looking forward to that. And I just actually returned last night from a retreat It's called The Gathering 2, which was the second official meeting of Black and African Buddhist teachers. So a lot of people actually said they would be interested, and a lot of people there's a lot of academics actually. It was very interesting. So there were 70 teachers. We were together for about a week, and then over the weekend they opened it up to the public, and there were about 320 people who came. So a number of the teachers are also academics. Some are actually, professors, and some are scholars, and some are lawyers, and some work at divinity schools. So a lot of people have books and have been writing about the intersection of faith and practice and academia. I think for me, there are a couple of places I'm really thinking about. I'm really thinking about ethics, sort of Buddhist ethics, Black ethics. Also thinking about the relationship between anti-Blackness as a philosophical theory, forwarded by Frank Wilderson and Jared Sexton, and many other people have picked it up. And then thinking about things like Buddhist ethics or karma or suffering. And actually this morning I was thinking about how no one thing, really in academia, a lot of times there's a kind of emphasis on like going deep, which is really important. But sometimes people get caught up in like there's like one thing or one worldview or one method. And I mean, the last 20 years, interdisciplinarity has become more widely accepted because the world is interdisciplinary. But it's like, oh, it's a special thing instead of like, actually, yes, there's art and science and humanities and law and, whatever. So really starting to do more scholarship around bringing more Buddhist philosophy into my scholarly work. So I'm finishing my first book right now, which is on queer aesthetics and hip hop culture in New York City. So I'm in the process of the final revision. So, it's gone out for review already, and now I'm trying to get it to, finalize that. But the second book is on actually science fiction, Blackness and science fiction. And there is actually a chapter on reincarnation and thinking about the relationship between human life and plant life, Black life, and then Black life turning to plant life. So there's a film I'm looking at, but then there's also some material stuff like when Mike Brown after he was murdered, and there was a tree planted for him in Ferguson, as many people plant trees and flowers for people who've died, it kept getting torn up. And so thinking about this relationship between human life and plant life and through a kind of reincarnation. So it's starting to, I'm wanting to really bring that together. And there's some history of this. So people like Bell Hooks have done, Eve Sedgwick, and sometimes I feel like that doesn't get taken seriously. But my real thought and real sort of outlook is that we need more in academia, particularly in terms of solving the world's, or at least slowing down the death process of the human species. We really need a lot of different tactics, For instance, I don't think like climate change can't just be stopped by scientific facts. You have to like touch people's hearts and touch their minds in a way that's meaningful to them. And that's not about, it cuts through politics or cuts through the ways that something as material and real as climate change has been politicized, let's say. So almost all religions have some aspect of caring for the planet, yet, or just even if someone's not religious, just ethically, just caring for your environment, right? Caring for your home and then caring for your broader home. So just from that point of view, there's a real emphasis in Buddhism and also in my tradition, which is a Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhist tradition. I think there may be probably someone's moved in. Someone's probably moved in and drilling. There's an emphasis on caring for the environment, one's own personal environment, and then the broader environment, caring for all beings and being kind of taking the responsibility as a human being because we're positioned in kind of a good way on the earth. Opposable thumbs really help, and logic and reason helps, and imagination helps, and then being able to use that to just be a steward for the earth, for this planet that we're on. So I think that there is a lot of that kind of people kind of dissolving some of the barriers to that, which are really purposeful, to keep, I think, us from having access to different kinds of ways of thinking about and inhabiting the world. I even talk about this with friends who work, say, in international human rights, and they say, yeah, we need more than policy and activism, and the burnout and the people are facing, life-threatening things, and it can't just be like, you're doing good work, right? Because people begin to self-harm because of the threats to their lives and their livelihood or their families or just the exhaustion. So it's something that I've been trying to integrate practically. It's like, got to get the first book out, prove myself in the field. And then, the second book is when you can be usually more exploratory. So that's one area.
Wow.
Yeah.
I wonder if we could talk about the suffering aspect a little bit, because I think we're at a time when everyone feels how sort of potent and raw a lot of people's experiences, and there's a lot of, I think on the surface level, anxiety and panic that can be kind of tapped into at any time because we're so aware of the dying process, like you said. And I think something that I navigate a lot of times in the art making that I want to do is how to talk about that and look at that, and also to be aware of the fact that like something is happening to us physically and emotionally when we're letting that much sort of suffering and pain wash through us all the times. I wonder if you have some insights on how to navigate that.
That's a very big question, which is, it's a contemplation, I think. More, I can give some thoughts that arise, but I think that is a real contemplation. And it's a real practice because this comes up a lot as a scholar. I talk about this with friends a lot, other scholars who are writing about, anti-Black racism, and the toll that takes on writing about why we use certain kinds of language. So sometimes people will say, oh, these academics, they use all that. But part of that is a safety protocol. It's like wearing goggles, in the lab, because it's actually very painful to write about historical and contemporary pain. It can make you a little crazy, actually, a lot crazy. I mean, it's a lot like what therapists and psychotherapists and psychiatrists have to do with the kind of vicarious trauma that happens from even reading about or going through these archives, and you're looking at and reading about really horrendous things that have been privatized in a way. Torture, centuries and centuries and centuries of torture practices that have been now institutionalized in different ways, in prisons or in war. But I think the truth of suffering that the historical Buddha Shakyamuni taught, actually it's like a paradox. It actually relieves suffering. There's some relief that there's suffering, or you could say there's pain. That is part of being alive, particularly sentient, which it seems, as science is telling us, that almost every, flowers and plants feel pain, and so it's like, okay, everything that's sentient, you have some kind of idea, and maybe humans might have more awareness of our mortality because we, write about it and create things about it. But there's the gift of life is bound up with the gift of death, and so that can create suffering. Just that knowledge that we came from somewhere, we're here, and we're going to go somewhere. That itself can drive people to do all kinds of things. As we see, we have all kinds of industries built on de-aging, stopping the aging process, stopping the death process. So I think just acknowledging that there's pain in being alive, that's part of the being alive, that's part of the juiciness of being alive, actually offers an incredible amount of relief. But you know, the historical Buddha, there have been many Buddhas, that's why we talk about Shakyamuni as a historical Buddha, didn't stop there. He said, you know, there's the truth of suffering, and there's causes. You know, we have birth, old age, illness or sickness, and death, right? And these are major causes of, you know, you can kind of trace all of our fears back to those things, and really to death, right? But to those kinds of things, loneliness, and so there's the kind of truth of suffering, there's a cause of suffering, and then he offered a path. There's a path to relieve our suffering. And really that's, you know, meditation, contemplation, study, you know, learning the nature of mind. And so that we're not fooled by the appearances. And that doesn't mean escaping, it means becoming more human. More human. Truly human. Not a god. Buddha wasn't a god. He was I say he was a superhero or a superhuman because he was truly human. And so really tapping into that humanity and being able to see the true from the false. And then there's a way out of suffering. Right? So there's a path to work with it and then a way out of it, which some people call nirvana, but in the Tibetan tradition, we really say there's no separation from nirvana and samsara. You can wake up through suffering, you can wake up through joy. It's sacred, it's all sacred. So there's no escape, there's no other place. It can be here now, we can wake up right now, one lifetime. So I think that is particularly helpful for people of African descent, particularly really starting in the 16th century when the construct of race became tied to the distribution of capital, which was our bodies, right? This sped up globalization, which had been going on for a while through the spice trade. But when you started trading bodies on a global level, not just people being prisoners of war, you know, and the old model of slavery was really, actually people became incorporated into the society. They would become sometimes prisoners of war, and sometimes it'd be terrible, but sometimes they could raise up, and there was no such thing as it being as permanent status that would then transfer to your children.
Wow.
Right? So that was your permanent status, rather than maybe you're a slave, but then you buy your freedom, or your child isn't necessarily a slave or something like that, or you're a prisoner of war who then becomes integrated into that society. This was a totally new model, which was that these people, they're not doing anything, we're just gonna make them, you know, that's their future. And so I think the erasure of the African continent as the pinnacle of not only the start of civilization, but the place where the Greeks got their, you know, information from, which wasn't just, it was actually Nubia. So the Egyptians went to Nubia, got, you know, all these great places, Aksum and Kemet or Egypt and Tatsum, all these places that were rose and fall all over the world, you know. We can't even imagine. Peoples did all kinds of things, you know, had all kinds of family and educational and agricultural and creative mathematical systems, and that there was a purposeful erasure of that by Europeans in the West. So Portugal, Great Britain, the Dutch, the Spanish, and the Italians, the French. Can't forget the French. And that there was a real valuation on the split between mind and body, which we've really inherited in the West. Particularly, I think people who are racialized as white, who really have been taught to feel the price of whiteness is giving up in your indigenous, you know, European heritage, that being a source of embarrassment, names becoming so bland, you know, and uncomplicated in quotes. And I think that has created an incredible amount of suffering in the form of, you know, colonization, in the form of enslavement, in the form of dispossession of indigenous people in the Americas, but also, you know, Australia and New Zealand, other places in the Caribbean, part of the Americas, duh. And I think that worldview has been tied to religion, and it's been so strong, and it's been so seductive that we think that we're supposed to stay in suffering. And then when we die, depending on what you believe, then you get to be relieved of suffering. But if we stay in suffering, it means we stay in fear. and we stay in a state of vigilance, and we stay in a state of depression or a state of defensiveness. And I can't actually tap into relaxation or freedom. We talk a lot about freedom in the United States, but we don't know what it is to be free. We don't know what it is to be free. Freedom is not your purchasing power, right? We really don't know what it is to be free in our own body, unadorned. If I had nothing, could I be really free? And I think freedom, words like freedom and joy have been commodified. Words like wellness, meditation, mindfulness have been commodified. And the suffering is just it's just a pointing out instruction. It's not where we stay. You know, it's like, this is the truth of our existence, but there's a way to work with that. And I think that a lot of people are sometimes turned off by Buddhism because they think that it's like all suffering. And, you know, it gets mixed a lot with Orientalism. And there's a lot of sense that like it's just like something esoteric. It's actually like very like the Buddhists over a period of 2,600 years now have done it all. Have thought every thought, have incredible, sophisticated. Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist psychology is incredibly intricate, incredibly complex. And as it moved from different country to different country, each place would develop these different systems. So different branches of Buddhism have these very complex ways of thinking about the mind and the body and the consciousnesses, and it goes on and on and on. The 8 this, and the 12's that, and the 4 this, and the 3 thises, and the 6, you know, it's just like, it's never ending, it's great. So there's a lot of contemplation given to existence and to our orientation as humans and our kind of resistance to like settling into our humanity. And I think, you know, one of the things that's very potent about, let's say, the United States, in particular, because we have a very particular kind of karma, right, or a very particular kind of habit, which is one of forgetfulness, erasure. We're really into the new. At the same time, there's some old things that we really value when they benefit the majority or they benefit the powerful, let's say. So, the Constitution, but it's like, it's a living, it's supposed to be, well, okay, I don't want to get into that argument, but it's supposed to be kind of a living document, I think, you know. And no, but it has to be this way, or even the Bible, right? And so I think that one of the things that's the suffering of a lack of memory is a very particular kind of suffering. The suffering of repression, the suffering of, you know, the land we're on right now, which is indigenous land, and also is so soaked with the blood of the, you know, indigenous folks, the tribes and the nations and the people that were here. And then on top of that, it's soaked with the blood of the enslaved and the migrant, right? And it's in the land, you can feel it. There's something about, you know, I lived in North Carolina for a couple of years, and there's something about crossing the Mason-Dixon line. The North has a different kind of, you know, the concrete makes you forget, but you can feel the commerce of slavery, right? Because that's where all the money was. But you can really feel the palpableness, or I can, in the land here, particularly in the deep south of the United States. And there's like a forgetting, purposeful forgetting that's like in contrast with like just your material experience. And so there's like it's like makes you crazy. And I think that there's a fear that we won't be able to recover from that level. And I think the less you are in your body, the easier it is to be into the new. The easier it is to kind of ignore suffering until it's too late, right? Or not be able to work with suffering. So there's a lot to be said about suffering, but it's not a permanent state. And a lot of the cause of suffering is really conceptual. That doesn't mean that we don't have actual things, like if you get stabbed, it's not, it's all in my mind. But there is an attitude that we can take towards our suffering. And there's also individualism, I think, increases our suffering. Because we just have a finite amount of internal resources. you know? And at some point we need some help, whether that's food from the land or whatever it is. You just can't do it by yourself, you know? And I think that the repression, the emphasis, the kind of distance from the body, embodiment, and then the kind of emphasis on concept, it creates a really bad situation. It creates a lot of illness, actually. Mm-hmm. And then when we get ill, or our temporary ability goes away, or the cycle of natural disaster strikes, or the cycle of life and death happens, or our favorite team loses, whatever, our TV show, you know, I was really, you know, Game of Thrones ending was very challenging for me. I was 2 years before it ended, I was, you know, bemoaning it. And so do we have the skills to work with those things, the change that is guaranteed in life? Mm-hmm. And many philosophies and religions and ways of seeing the world offer real opportunities to contemplate, not to just say you believe something, but to really practice, contemplate, and let your whole life be kind of soaked in what it feels like to live a contemplative life, which it's not really a fad, and it's not something that other people may even want, interestingly. They may want the result, but not the effort. And it may not be something that looks glamorous, or it may look wonderful, you know? And it's not, you know, I was thinking about this, it's not about imposed things, but it really comes from internal. So it's like, I was talking to someone, I was just on retreat, and I was saying, oh, you know, yeah, like I've been recycling since I was a teenager, because where I was growing up, I lived between New York and Connecticut, and Connecticut really had a jump on recycling in the 90s. I'm not really sure why. It probably had to do with reducing trash and the cost of that. Maybe it's because I lived also on the coast. So the beaches would be closed because there'd be all this, you know, trash, and it'd be like needles. That would be the worst. Trash, okay, there's a plastic bag. But the needles, you know, it'd be so. Now the beaches there are amazing. But and so I really just got into this habit of thinking about things I was using and that they went somewhere. And I have to say that I didn't know. I was like 12. I didn't know where things went. I didn't realize that we buried our trash in the ground. I had no idea. I mean, you're a kid, I had to be taught. And so that doesn't come from a place of superiority. It comes from me being trained, one, from a relatively young age, and then being thoughtful. And this building does not recycle, which I did not know, partly because buildings have to pay for more than single stream recycling. So this building only pays for cardboard. I don't know what they're going to do once the building's filled up, because it's only about 60% occupancy. So many places make retail businesses pay. So I bring my recycling to work because I work at a zero waste place, so I can bring everything. I can compost. Now I do compost in New York. It's much easier. But anyway, so I bring everything to work. I have compost in my freezer here, and but it's making me think about what I use, because I can't just put it in recycling. So I'm like, oh, you know, and I'm getting, and it's not like good, bad. It's more like I live by myself. Okay, I have a dog. Dog food comes in a plastic bag, whatever. But I'm like, oh, I use a lot of things that have a lot of wrapping, and not all, and some of it doesn't need to, and some of it does need to, because people are gross and open up things and spit in it, as we discovered this summer on the internet. But some things, it's like, okay, I can bring my own little bags, and so it's more of a contemplation, and it's more of a practice than a rigidity and feeling bad and feeling guilty. It's working with becoming more cognizant of the space I take up in the world through consumption. And so learning about, maybe I, you know, can consume less. How do I do that? Maybe retail therapy isn't the greatest thing to do, right? Because I'm creating more waste potential. So one of my good friends was here a few weeks ago. She's a lawyer. She works at the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. And she says, you know, she's like, it's sad when you contemplate that the best thing you can do for the earth is die. So the first thing is not have kids. Second thing is to die. And it's like, yep, well, I guess we're all going to do that. So, and then there's a sense of humor. I think having a sense of humor about this stuff is really important. I think people get so serious that the Dharma is so serious and yoga is so serious and Ugh, oh man, it's so annoying. You know, it's like that's like a vestment or something. That's like a putting on. It's just like, what of your, you know, personality, as it were, comes out, you know? And so we're each a little different, you know? Some people are more serious and scholarly. Some people are more animated. Some people are more, you know, I like to swear a lot when I'm teaching the Dharma. It's just part of, you know. I also swear when I teach as a professor, and my students are so conservative. They're like, Dr. Smalls, hee hee hee. They giggle. They're like, school is, and I'm like, y'all, you know. So they're really funny. And I was like, I'm sorry if I offend you. Sometimes I get really excited, and they're like, okay, you know. So yes, suffering, I think, is our teacher, and it's not our it doesn't have to be shackled, or it doesn't have to be oppress us. And when I touch suffering, I can actually touch joy, wakefulness. You know, that's how you wake up. That's what they say. That is how I've woken up. You know, the little bit that I've woken up to my own habits of mind, it's been through my own bad behavior. It hasn't been through like doing good things. It's been like, you know, the 15,000th time I was cursing someone on the street. and it stopped me. My own bad behavior, I could see and experience my own bad behavior, and it felt so, I didn't want to be like that. So, you know, that took time to like get through to me to get through to me. So it's through my own bad behavior that I actually see the truth of suffering, and then I have a choice about how I want to work with that. So it's very interesting. I mean, I see it like with my dog, and when I had two, they would like, most dogs will eat until their stomach literally explodes. They won't stop. Because they're immediate animals. They're like, they don't know that, even though there's a rhythm and they know when it's time to eat, they really do. It's also like there's, you know, and I have friends who have dogs who like won't eat all their food, and I'm like, well, I didn't get those dogs. But seeing them doing particular things over and over again that cause pain and it taking a while for them to get. So, you know, all beings have suffering. You know, some beings die, like a bee stings you. Well, I'm also allergic to bees, so I try not to, but then they die, you know? So it's interesting to think about what certain habits can do to us, how they can really steal our life and mind away from us. And yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So I think you opened this up with what you just said, but I wonder if sometimes I've encountered in myself resistance to the idea that contemplative practice or work on myself is going to be the key to the things that I'm frustrated around me are the way that they are. And there's almost this idea that that's the same as saying like thoughts and prayers when you know the next shooting happens, kind of a thing. But I feel like in part of my maturing process, I've realized that is the only thing I have control over is what's happening in here. I wonder if you could kind of bridge in terms of some of these institutionalized harms, what the connection is between what happens inside of us and then changing what's happening around us.
I would say that all Buddhist practice is meant to be practiced in concert with others as well as ourselves. So it's the individualism or the idea of, you know, the first thing that the Buddha did when he woke up was to teach the sentient deer, teach him Deer Park, teach the sentient beings around him. It was deer at first. It wasn't to keep it to himself,
Wow.
right? And then very quickly he really changed society. He changed the world. Part of why he taught women, even though that was not okay. And he had to actually be somewhat forced to, because he was a product of his time. And so there's the idea that being reincarnated as a man was better. So eventually he was, his wife, whom he left, he like ordained his son before his wife, right? So Yashodhara, like eventually was like, you gonna teach us, you know? And so, and a whole bunch of other women.
I did not know he had a wife.
He had a wife and a son, Yashodhara, and then Rahula. Rahula's, his name gets evoked a lot in different places, and he was a teacher. And then the Buddha's mother was an enlightened being, reached enlightenment. His wife reached arhatship, so great levels of meditative absorption. She was a great teacher and practitioner. There's a book I just got called The Buddha's Wife, which is her story. It's sort of a fictional / historical retelling of her story. But so he built a community. That's why in Buddhism we say we take refuge in the Buddha as an example of a wakeful human being, the Dharma as the teachings of truth or wakefulness, and the Sangha, community of practitioners. So it's not about the people who go sit in the mountains, who do 12-year retreats in caves, or who do 3-year retreats in caves or whatever. They're actually doing that for the benefit of all beings. That practice is not just for them, it's for all beings. And it's actually really hard. It's actually much easier to practice in relationship to other people because you get just energy. It's like going to the gym or going to a yoga class versus practicing at home. You just, the energy, right, of other people. So, but all those individual practices are, you know, those great ascetics, they practice for other people. That life of renunciation is because most people in the world won't do that, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not for most of us, you know? That's not for most of us. And so most of us are just lay people. We're just regular old schmoes, you know? And we practice in our work, in our family context, in being a boss or a worker or whatever we are in our art. So it's about the relationship with society. So depending on what Buddhist schools or traditions you talk to, in my tradition and my lineage, wakefulness, and I actually, as I really was at this retreat with many, many different Buddhist lineages, a lot of people were saying that, you know, and this is the actually prediction in the Buddhist sutras, that the next Buddha is society. It's a societal Buddha. So we have to wake up as a community. Maitreya, Buddha Maya, the future Buddha, is communal. It's not an individual. It's not a savior anymore. That was a, you know, Buddha Shakyamuni and Christ and Muhammad. That was a different time. The world was completely different then. This the ancient world, and the world needed individuals like that. But we're so connected now that we need all of it. We're so connected and disconnected that we need the societies to wake up, families to wake up, nations to wake up, towns to wake up, right? It's not just the world is too noisy for it to be one person. It's very dangerous, I think. We have seen what happened in the last, few hundred years when it becomes a cult of personality. That, one person really can't hold that, and it's usually something very small versus what we can hold as, 100 people, or 1,000, or 1,000,000, or 1,000,000,000. So I think that it does feel like societal wakefulness is, and there is something happening, around the world. You see children building things out of trash. I remember I was reading the story, I think the kid was from Ghana, and he built a pulley system for electricity that would make electricity for like 150 people. Because of the land and the wiring, they couldn't be wired. They were too rural to be wired for electricity, and they weren't a priority. But he figured out this pulley system with like plastic bottles, and I was like, what? I can't even, I can barely make fire, I can make fire. But it's like, so seeing kids do that, and then I saw another guy, Nigeria who's building furniture and bags out of tires instead of getting people not to burn them. And then these other little nerdy like white guys who are like built this thing that collects trash out of the ocean and turns it into fuel. I mean, just so people are and have been doing really incredible things and spreading them and spreading habits. And I think that does catch fire. And then there's pushback. But I think there have been and there are global movements around remembering remembering sustainable ways of being in the world, honoring, being grateful, not taking for granted that we have food, because some people don't, not taking for granted that things grow and that the sun still reaches us, so that we aren't freezing, and that we as of yet haven't totally drowned under all the water. I sometimes think, why is this called Earth when it's mostly water? Anyway, but that, so that there's a kind of rhythm. And in my own personal life, I've been really working with this in the last, I would say really since 2017. I've been really trying to work with, can I work in late capitalism? Can I work in the rhythm of the seasons? Now, the academic year runs completely counter to that. Like October is so busy for some reason. Midterms, this, that, and the third, I don't know why. And then April is also insane in academia. But can I slow down? Can I work at the rhythm of the seasons? What does that feel like? And it's hard when there's email and grading and writing. And for me, writing takes a long time. And deadlines but just holding it as a contemplation, holding it as I think the Soto Zen say, or the Rinzai say, koan, so like a public record, right? Like a public contemplation, right? Can I? And it's hard because then you see your friends, wow, they've got 7 million things going on and they had this publication and that publication and this award and then here I am like a little turtle, But it just feels more doable, because then there's also life, paying bills, taking naps, going for walks, working out, feeding myself, seeing friends, having it's just like trying to do it all. But the aspect of being in community is so important. And I do think that anything that emphasizes individual wakefulness over that, instead of in relationship to that, I think is imbalance. I think it's both. Like I have to do my individual sitting, contemplation practices, and then I also need to be in relationship to a community. That helps me. Both, they reinforce one another. So I think there's a big misunderstanding in the West, and in particular the US, but not just. I also talk to friends in Europe, Canada, who have this issue. It's a big misunderstanding about what it means to be a practitioner. It's all engaged because anything that's calling for less harm in the world is engagement. If I'm making a vow to do less harm, then I have to look at where I'm doing harm in the world. I have to begin to get honest about that. So right there is some kind of engagement with the world, because the harm I'm doing is not just to myself, it's to other beings. But I think it's been sort of packaged as some sort of individual thing. If my practice makes me more of an asshole, weirder, less generous, more arrogant, then it's useless. It's useless. It's not real. It's just not real. It's not supposed to make me more separate from people. It's supposed to make me more available, unfortunately. So I do think that all Buddhism is engaged Buddhism. Even, my friends who are monastics, the things that they do, I've practiced and studied in a monastery, and I was like, I could never do this.
Really?
It is a hard life. And all their practice is for the benefit of beings. They've renounced the world so that they can be of the optimum benefit. And it is truly a sacrifice. And then also it's hard living with other monastics. They're all jerks, you know what I mean? And they're living in community and trying to work that out. You know, that's really hard. And they're dealing with every dynamic, racism and sexism, classism and homophobia and transphobia. They're dealing with all the things we deal with in a monastic, trying not to bypass it spiritually, you know? Plus you have the lineages, which are also incredibly patriarchal. You're trying to separate the wisdom from the context from which they came, which every single religious and spiritual, not every, but many, many of the major world religions have erased the feminine and have uplifted, overemphasized the masculine. And so those principles aren't balanced. So you know, the monastics are actually doing incredible, you know, they have these restricted diets. I'm like, oh no, you know, no chocolate, you know. So they're doing really incredible work and studying, you know, a lot and not accumulating things, which I think is, you know, hard. But then they're also modern, you know. It's like I like that I can text my monastic friends, you know, or email them. So I mean, I think it is. It's always that self and other, that tango, I would say. My hope is that Dharma, which doesn't even have to be called Dharma, can reach places where it's not. You know, part of the issue now is that the relationship between Dharma and capitalism is so entwined. And that doesn't mean I don't think teachers, I'm a teacher, and we shouldn't be paid, whether it's through dana, you know, through students feeling like a heart gift, feeling inspired, or through some set price. But that, like yoga, or asana, yoga asana, it's become unreachable for so many people because it's become industry. And you know, now many people, including myself and many thousands, hundreds of thousands of others, are working to try to get it into places because now people feel it's not for them. You know, yoga now we're yoga and asana. Now we are having Black-owned studios, or Asian-owned studios, or Latinx-owned studios. I don't know if they're indigenous folks, I'm sure, owned studios. We are having Black, indigenous, and people of color teachers, meditation teachers, yoga asana teachers. Because the violence of going into a yoga studio and being the only body that looks like yours is serious. And some people say, oh, it shouldn't matter. But then I know a lot of men, white men, who won't go to a yoga studio because they feel it's too feminine. So you'll go to a yoga class if it's a bunch of dudes, you know, so like they don't get like why a Black person might not want to go to an all-white studio, but they understand implicitly their discomfort about being the only man, or male-bodied person, or masculine person even. So I think that because these things have become industries, they've become also inaccessible. And these are ancient wisdoms that really work with us 360 degrees for our health. Not to like have a body that looks a certain way or to be in shape. That can be an ancillary benefit. But really to, you know, the movement, whether it's yoga asana, whether it's qigong, whether it's lifting weights, whether it's karate, kung fu, whether it's tai chi, whether it's, I don't know, Pilates, whatever people do, P90X. It's to bring the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system down so that one can be actually in touch. You know, athletes talk about this. They get to a point where they're actually in something. There's a book, that book, Flow, you know, where you're actually artists too, where you've actually done some work to bring down all the chatter and to relax into the confidence that's inherent in you, because you've worked off some of that bodily and mental steam. And I think sometimes when we just work out, we forget to actually reflect and care for ourselves and think about the relationship and learn about our bodies. So I'll tell you a little story. I was a pretty serious athlete growing up. I wanted to play soccer in college, and I wanted to go to the Olympics. So I started playing soccer when I was 6, and I was like very, very serious. soccer player and football, for those of you who live in the rest of the world. I eventually really gave up playing sports for art, to do art instead. But one of the things I realized is that when I was younger, like probably to my late 20s, exercise was really about the machinery of my body, the mechanism, the optimization of the body, making sure I had, very little body fat and this and that, blah, 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 blah. And it was a lot about control, the controlling the body. And then when I was in my late 20s, I had a pretty serious health encounter, and I actually had cancer when I was 27. And it really shook my relationship because I was this very thin, too thin, frankly, muscly kind of person who was very controlling about my body. And what really happened over that incredibly terrifying process of being diagnosed with cancer at such a young age, seeing a million doctors, going through the allopathic, I could write 10 books on this, the industry, the cancer industry, right? I was lucky I had some great doctors that I still have, and having to develop a different relationship to the body and the mind, and realizing how separate my body and my mind were, how disembodied I actually was. Which is weird. I loved to dance, and I played sports, and I loved sex and whatever. I loved eat, but I was really disembodied. And so I had a relationship to the body, but it was a relationship that was about control and about optimization. And so, my relationship has changed, and it's like, oh, what is it like? I remember when I first had a belly, and oh, what is it like to be strong but not have a six-pack or whatever. And so it's been really an interesting journey, and I'm much more in the body. I can tell when I'm much more in tune with my body. I'm much more connected. I'm not disembodied, at all. And so that was something that got my attention. And through working with a somatic, my psychotherapist is a somatic therapist, and she worked so hard for many years to get me into the body. And my meditation practice really supports that, and my yoga asana practice, meditation is an embodied, mindfulness, there's a 4 foundation of mindfulness, and mindfulness of body is one of them. So that relationship is so important. And if we're in contact with our bodies, we're more likely to be comfortable being in contact with other bodies.
I'm really grateful to hear you talk about the accessibility piece. I'm grateful that sort of spirituality as a monolith is kind of having a resurgence as, we need more tools, but I also see the commodification working exactly opposite of that. And I've kind of come at that most through access to plant medicine, but I feel like that goes very much hand in hand with the mindfulness piece. So I'd just be curious to hear what you've seen from the communities that need it, where you've been able to bring it, how that's helped people.
Well, I will say that many people, particularly many black people, are somewhat suspicious because they've heard about meditation through the ways that, much of other people in the West have heard about it, which is sort of through movies and, through weird Dalai Lama. Like someone asked me in this retreat if the Dalai Lama was the head of all Tibetan Buddhism, and we're like, oh no, that's it. The Dalai Lama is a political title. So the current Dalai Lama he was actually a rebel. He was actually like a warrior. He's a military figure. And he was kind of, so he's a political figure. He's the leader, he's the spiritual leader of Tibetans in exile. And he's in a particular Tibetan tradition, the Gelug tradition. And there are other Tibetan Buddhist schools that have their own heads with different names. So they're like, oh, okay. So just that piece, because he's a political figure, that's how many people have learned about Buddhism. And then, but Buddhism didn't come to Tibet until like the 7th century or something like that. So many, many years after the Buddha. So it didn't come from India to Tibet until a guy named Padmasambhava or Guru Rinpoche brought it. But it spread to, other places, Thailand and China, Zen, Japan, Chan, which is Zen, which just means meditation, first to China, then to Japan and Korea. So I think that people sort of think it's weird a little bit. But where I've mostly, I'll tell you the couple places where I've brought these practices. One is prisons and jails. So there's a lot of work. It has been a lot of work for a long time going on prisons and jail. I grew up in a evangelical Christian family, and we would go to bring things. So I've been doing this for a long time, bring Jesus, Bible stuff to prisons and jails. But I did some work with the Lineage Project when I lived when I was 10 or 15 years ago, and they work with young people in prisons, jails, and halfway houses and courthouses doing yoga and meditation. They're much more organized now. Then it was sort of like a fledgling thing, but they have trainings, and that work is really amazing. And there's a whole bunch of people who used to, I don't know what's happening now with Rikers, but bring meditation to Rikers Island. So I've been doing prison work for a long time. I also have really in the last, since 2016, really been focusing on Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. So running those kinds of groups and retreats and teaching. And now usually when I teach a weekend, a meditation weekend, usually what I'll do is ask for if it's a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, I'll ask for the Sunday to either be a day for Black, Indigenous, people of color or LGBTQ folks. That's sort of pay what you can. So, and on weekly Dharma gathering, really also trying to promote younger, Gen X, and now I'm like, okay, Gen X, we're not young anymore, the millennial, and then hopefully in the next few years, Gen Z teachers, and teachers of color, and queer and trans teachers, and also somatic, different kinds of work, and artists. I've really started to change my emphasis, and because I'm not a full-time Dharma teacher, nor at this point in my life do I want to be, I have some flexibility in when I can do things that are completely free, and a lot of that also has been through connecting with other Black, Indigenous, people of color teachers of different traditions. So I was able to be part of Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams's Black Wisdom Summit online, which had teachers from all different traditions and lineages. It was supposed to be a few days, and then they extended it to a month, and then they extended it to 2 months of teachings free. So that kind of thing. I've done things with Buddhist Peace Fellowship, that also online, and also just offering people instruction, if they want it. And it's also something that I've started to integrate into the classroom, which is a little tricky, but I sometimes ask my students if they want those resources, and they do. So I've had students come to get meditation instruction, or they've asked me different places where they can go. And as part of my pedagogy, especially when I'm teaching classes, like I taught a graduate class last semester in the spring on anti-Blackness, and I was realized that I needed to give them the stuff that we were reading and talking about. The students were just so worn down, and so I was giving them plant people to follow on Instagram. I was I follow a lot of people on Instagram around plants and different resources, different places like Heal House and Bed-Stuy, that there's stuff on financial stuff, and there's yoga and meditation and community things, and different places they can meditate, and free things like that. So I think having a more holistic view, and introducing people in a way that is more informational, that seems to be working for a lot of different people. And also what I've seen spring up in the last couple of years is people just started meditation groups on their own. They're not related to a tradition. Maybe someone's taking a teacher training, or it's a lot of times it'll be a loose group of wellness people who will say, let's just do something that's accessible. So, and then my friend Julio Rivera, who started the Liberate app, which is a meditation app for and by Black, Indigenous, people of color. All the teachers are Black, Indigenous, Asian, Latinx, mixed race, and it's really amazing. And people who feel like, oh, then they're hearing voices and topics that are meaningful to them, and not just like some highfalutin philosophy that has nothing to do with real life. I've just made a commitment really to bring the whatever wisdom of the Dharma that is accessible to me as a teacher to other people. So that's a big part of my practice. Yeah.
Thank you
You're
for doing
welcome.
that.
And then there are people who can pay, and then that's fine. And so for me, having figuring that, working with that as a practice too, and saying, this is what I can offer, and sometimes I say, yeah, I'll just do that, and sometimes I say I can't. That feels really valuable and important, and the way to really propagate the Dharma and propagate these healthy ways of working with ourselves, and also not asking people to give up anything, or to convert to anything, or to become anything, or to call themselves anything. These are just tools that you can integrate into your life. And all traditions really have traditions of contemplation. It's just they may not be emphasized. In Buddhism, contemplation is meditation and contemplation is the main practice. But all traditions have, whether it's going off on a vision quest, or whether it's sitting, be still and know that I am God, or whatever it is. There's instructions for contemplation, but they've maybe been lost or not as popular. But just reminding people the wisdom they already have, just helping give them some tools to access it. We all have that wisdom. It's just about technology. It's just like different technologies of breath and body and mind training that we all can be taught. So it wasn't like when I started really getting serious about meditation. I came to meditation when I was a teenager, but I got more serious in my early 20s. And what I really realized eventually through practice was that I wasn't really trying to become anything. I was just trying to remember my inherent wisdom. And for me, I was really drawn to this particular way of waking up. My upbringing, I actually really, really value, now, my very Christian upbringing. And I also saw that I couldn't actually access my wisdom through those particular methods or those particular technologies. Other people can, and I really appreciate that there are many, many paths to wisdom. But what I really saw was that, these technologies work for me. These practices actually help me to get serious about waking up in this lifetime. So, yeah. It's available for anyone and everyone. Anyone can people say, I can't meditate, I can't quiet my mind. I say, okay, well, it's not about quieting your mind, it's about getting familiar with your mind. And also, if you've ever had a thought about yourself, or if you've ever obsessed about anything, you can meditate. Because meditation simply means placing the mind on an object. So usually the object is ourselves. Our thoughts, our fantasies, our fears, our wishes, our hopes, our delusions, or sometimes something else or someone else, And then, the most simplest form of mindfulness meditation is placing the mind on the feeling of the body breathing, right? Because the breath for most of us, not all of us, is there and accessible. But even people who have breathing problems, people become aware of how much breath they actually have. So because the breath is always there, it regulates us. It's a natural regulator. And it's learning to tap into that rather than our speedy minds or our crowded minds, which is what we usually pay attention to. We led around by the mind rather than the breath. So it's sort of balancing that out. It's balancing that situation out so that we're not so top heavy. Yeah.
I think that's so challenging for modern operating systems, and particularly like Western operating systems, is to observe something without then having to act immediately after. And even like relating to what we were talking about, you know, dealing with injustice in the world, that feeling of like constant, there's always something that needs to be addressed. Yeah.
And I think to answer that question more specifically, where meditation really helps is it teaches us how to act, when to act, what to do. Skill, we talk about in Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana, which just means diamond-like or speedy, quick wakefulness. Skillful means. So sometimes we have the heart, like, oh, I want to do something, but we do it really unskillfully, and we create more mess, either for ourselves or others, and then we say, oh, fuck it, it didn't work. Or someone says, well, you did that and it didn't work, so that doesn't work, right? Our heart was in the right place, but we didn't have the skills. So part of it is learning how to skillfully work, because actually systems of injustice are really complex, purposefully, and because we're also all imbricated in them. So learning how to, sometimes it calls for a rally and sometimes it calls for a check, or sometimes it calls for a conversation, or sometimes it calls for a piece of writing, right? Or sometimes it calls for grassroots organizing, or whatever it is. So learning what's the appropriate thing. Sometimes it's calling someone else and saying, what do you think? And if we don't have a sense of skillfulness, if we don't have an array of tools, then we can have the greatest intentions and the greatest heartfelt desire to be of service, but we just mess it up. We just bungle it because we're not skillful, because we're so hysterical because of our own history, or we're too angry to see clearly. We're not able to actually use the anger as a clarifying tool. The anger becomes a cloudy tool. Anger can be incredibly clarifying. It's energy. It's good. There's nothing wrong with it. It's juicy. It's like we know fire can give life or destroy life, right? So it's learning how to be skillful. And people have done things to give us tools, And so it's like I really had to learn how to channel my incredible anger and rage and I'm like, well, you got to let it out, and that's true, you do. But I don't have to let it out on other people or myself. And so learning how to work with, oh wow, this is a lot going on here. I'm so angry. Maybe I just need to curse or listen to some hip hop or work out, because there is incredible injustice and I am angry and it needs to stop and I don't know how to stop it. And so how do you abolish the police when they are a force of the state and have really complete and utter no oversight? And I don't just mean the spectacular things that happen, like murdering someone who's playing video games with her nephew, Tatiana Jackson, right? Or walking into someone else's apartment and shooting them because you were scared, Botham Jean, right? This goes for the way that police routinely sexually assault women, men, and children on stops. This goes for the high incidences of intimate partner violence with police. This goes for the high incidence of suicide. The thin line between cops and robbers. What do you do with all that cocaine and those guns and money you confiscate, right? The relationship between organized crime and police and politics, and so it's a whole, it's a whole thing of carrying a gun, carrying mace, carrying a baton, wearing a uniform. And some of those people are coming from military backgrounds. They have serious PTSD. If you say you have PTSD, guess what happens to you? You don't get to do what you want to do anymore. You get put on a desk, right? So there's a culture of patriarchy toxic masculinity, repressed emotions, you know, there's all kinds of stuff. And then you're saying these people are here to serve and protect. So it's a recipe for disaster, really. There's so much speed, there's so little training, there is training, there's a lot of training on really fucked up attitudes. There's a long legacy of the police as slave catchers, right? So they evolved from, or as to police the poor, right? I think there's a great history of the policing in the US and the UK, and I think Jacobin a few years ago, and it was just giving this very detailed history of how the policing evolved. And it's really about policing immigration, policing people coming to this country, policing black folks, policing indigenous folks, policing the poor. And so when the police are really a political force, or the military force of the wealthy or the connected, it's never about serve and protect. But you say something, I say something like that, people are like, oh my God, we cry. But like, what if we actually took a different attitude towards crime and towards violence by developing systems that, you know, if we didn't have so much inequity, there wouldn't be so many survival crimes. You know, people don't sell drugs because it's fun. It's actually really dangerous to sell drugs. Sure, it's now been made glamorous, but, you know, if you're a street runner, you know, it's dangerous. It's dangerous to carry a lot of cash, you know? It's dangerous to carry a lot of drugs. And people do this for survival. And because of skill gaps. And because of racism. And people steal because to get, you know, food and clothing and shelter. And so, to me, this is a very Buddhist view of, well, of course, inequity is going to cause more suffering. Of course, it's going to create a whole other industry of crime, quote unquote, or of illegal businesses, because you can't get into that door. That's legal. So it's like, what would happen if we had more, we were connected to each other better, we were more accountable to each other, and we, you know, we didn't move at such speed that we just saw other human beings as in our way. And so we could take their lives so easily, or hurt them so easily, or knock them over the head so easily. We just saw them as opportunities to gain, accumulate more. But that starts at the top. That starts with legal business. We just see people as, you know, a source to accumulate more goods. I mean, you can't tell me that, you know, Jeff Bezos isn't a criminal of some sort. No one should be a billionaire, but he's probably going to be the first trillionaire. And it's not don't buy Amazon or whatever. It's more like he could actually pay the people who work in the Amazon fulfillment centers well. You know, they could actually have breaks that were breaks. I mean, I know people who worked in this fulfillment, and they've told me the, you know, the horror stories. And it's not like, oh, Amazon is evil. Right. It's not. It's more like, how do we get to a place where someone like that is outside of accountability? Mm-hmm. Because people could stop buying from Amazon today, and he would still be making money because they own so much stuff. You don't even know. You don't even know. And then it becomes the fabric of our lives, and we're like, shit, man, we're all, you know, we all got our iPhones or our whatevers, and it's all part of this lack of kind of accountability to each other. We're just numbers to each other or something, you know? So I do think a lot about what's possible beyond the way that capitalism has conditioned us to think about our lives and each other and society. It's been very interesting being in Atlanta and living in this building, and you know, this is like a little luxury building, which I could never afford to live in New York, so I'm taking advantage of it here because it's cheaper than my one-bedroom apartment in New York, a 100-year-old building. But I'm missing the communal aspect. The dog people, we have a text group, and you know. But in my building in New York, you know, I live in New York City, and people don't think of New York City as a very communal place, but my neighbors have keys. More than one set of neighbors have keys to my super has a set of keys to my apartment. I have keys to their apartment. We walk each other's dogs. We get each other's mails. We get each other's packages before someone can steal them. You know, the laundromat across the street. I walk in. They say, "Hey, Dr. Smalls." They let the homeless people in the neighborhood wash their clothes there. My neighborhood is super communal, and that just aspect of knowing people and asking people if they need, you know, the older people, do you need me to bring your groceries? And there's a different sense of here. I feel much more. It's harder. Everyone's got their cars and their own little thing, and it feels like it's harder to make that connection. And there's something that happens when we're separated from each other. There's like a violence that begins to be created. And it's like, I automatically start to think of you as my enemy because I don't know you. What is a system that holds people accountable when they do something harmful or violent look like? What would prisons and jails look like if they were restorative spaces and transformative spaces where they didn't actually turn people into, you can't even say animals because animals, you know, I mean, but look what happens when you cage animals. You don't give them love, you know, particularly mammals. We need contact. I just saw something today about the way Swedish prisons look, and then I watched this whole thing on Japanese prisons, and I was like, they have yoga mats. They get these meals. There's like a whole menu now. You can go and tour this old Japanese prison, and of whole fish and right, and it's not an industry. And there's a limit, I think, in the Scandinavian countries on even that guy who murdered all those kids like a number of years ago. The limit is 25 years. So he murdered like, I don't know, 100 people or something, over children. But they garden and they teach them how to be human again. That's, you know, sometimes murder happens because of self-defense or an accident. And sometimes, you know, we kill out of disconnection, or we rape out of disconnection, but what would it be like to have some space where you said, you know what? I feel like very few people actually need to be in prison. Some people really need to be separated from society to be re-taught how to connect with their inherent wakefulness. But that's not what we have. We don't have that kind of system. We kill people. We have given permission to the state to murder people for murder, which doesn't make any sense. And we have given permission to, when we put people in prison or even jails now, to forget about them, and whatever happens to them, good for them. And so that when they come out, we're then shocked that people aren't reformed, or that maybe they've learned how to be better criminals, and that the drugs and the alcohol and the violence in there, it's a horror show. And so all of that is fueled by incredible disconnection, incredible lack of value for life, an incredible sense that there are some people who are worthy of living and some people aren't. You know, and some people hear this and think, this is the way it has to be, but it's not always been this way. Mm-hmm. You know? And are we so lazy that we can't really put our minds together to think of different ways of dealing with the human condition besides just killing people or locking them away? Or saying certain life has value and certain life doesn't. So I can't believe that, and I don't feel that makes me particularly liberal or anything. I just think it makes me someone who values life and who values being thoughtful. And maybe I don't want everything to feed this monster of money making. And we can all actually have nice things. There's actually plenty of nice things to go around the world, plenty. There's no reason in a country like ours. I mean, it's really only in industrialized countries you have homelessness. Other places in the world, yeah, people maybe don't have great homes or indoor plumbing, but why are people living on the street here? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. It does not make one lick of, and it's actually a problem we can actually solve. There are many problems that are, can't solve. But this is a solvable problem in the United States. And there are, it's a small percentage of people, if you gave them a home, they still wouldn't be, but that's very small. Just give people a home. Give people a little bit of money. What they do with it is their business. It's just a home, like a little cute, a little tiny home, a little shelter, some dignity around being clean. And you don't know actually what that could do for someone, I've never understood why there's homelessness. And I think that closing our hearts, and I will say this, that where I learned that from was really in my Christian community when I'm growing up, because my parents were evangelical Christians, reverends, Pentecostal reverends. And they would always, at the holidays and throughout the year, and I would get so annoyed, bring some person. First of all, we'd have to go to soup kitchens, and I was like, ugh. But then I really grew to love that. And also, we would bring people who didn't have family or who were sort of semi-homeless to our house for the holidays. They would bring people up from the city when we lived in Connecticut, because that was country to a lot of people. And so by the time I was 13, I was doing Habitat for Humanity, and I really was dedicated to the eradication of homelessness. That was Christian value, the compassion for other people, and then doing something about an injustice in the world. That's where I learned that. I learned that from my parents. And not letting other people suffer if I had the ability to do something about it. Even that meant just giving them a meal, So I do think that I've continued that just in a different tradition. I feel very strongly about rethinking how we work with pain, with suffering, with violence. And I think, just leaving it up to the state is always going to be, the easiest answer, which is lock them up, throw away the key, or kill them, or, The harder thing is how do you actually reform a human heart? That takes a lot of resources, human resources, time. But that means that we actually change people's lives rather than create more suffering. I worry about the karma we're creating. Karma just means action. I worry about what we're putting into the world when you kill people. And we know this system is also unfair, when you murder them, state-sanctioned murder. And also, up until very recently, we put people in the electric chair. We didn't even give them put them to sleep. We hung them, we shot them. It was violent, So these are the things I think about as a Buddhist practitioner, right? These are the things I work on. I support organizations like Just Leadership USA that is based out of New York but is spreading across the country. New York, interestingly, has some of the worst discovery, cash bail, and trial laws. Trial discovery, cash bail, and there's one other thing that they do terribly. And so Just Leadership works with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people to help them to advocate for reforms. Because there's something like 18 to 21,000 people in jails, uncharged, on a daily basis. No charges, right? And that could be 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years, right? Depending on how the speedy trial or the discovery process, the speedy trial process. New York doesn't have really speedy trial. So really getting hip to that, and I really got into that work through my Buddhist Sangha and supporting that work. And I also am a big supporter of EJI, Equal Justice Initiative, and their work to end the death penalty and wrongful incarceration. And, so I've done that work professionally too. When I worked for Amnesty International, in the US context, I worked on the impact of prisons, jails, and policing on people of color. and LGBTQ communities. So this is like work that's very close to my heart. You know, I had a father who spent 20 of the first 40 years of his life in and out of prison. So the effect of incarceration is very, very real on people's minds and lives and development. And that kind of institutionalization is really terrible. So as a Buddhist, I feel super engaged in the world and the world's problems, because I feel engaged in also solving my, working with my problems, and I see the externalization of our individual problems into that then become systems. The externalizing of certain thoughts become systems. It starts with someone's mind. The prison industrial complex started with someone's mind, right? You can read Foucault to go back to, think about the birth of the prison, right? It started in someone's mind, chattel slavery. It started in someone's mind, colonization. It started in someone's mind, patriarchy, right? So these things start in someone's or some people's minds, and then they become codified as you do whatever formulas to say it's true or it's real or it's divine or whatever. So it starts all in the mind, and then it becomes externalized. So that's why working with myself is good, because the things that I've put out in the world sometimes have been fucked up, And then if we're working with our minds to see clearly, we're putting less and less crazy things out there that harm people. And then we're seeing the things around us that are actually trapping us and others. And we're wanting to tear those things down and build different kinds of things, but that takes, like I said, that takes a lot of investment from a lot of people. And so many of us, including myself, are invested in some part of this system. It's hard to divest. And it's a slow process, I think, for many of us. But I think that's the only way to really have any kind of wakefulness, is to really begin to divest the things I don't really need. Think about what my investments are. Think about what my beliefs are. Why do I have these things? Why do I think, such and such? Why do I have these reactions, And that may take a combination of practice, psychotherapy, whatever, a lot of different things to really kind of get honest about the things that keep my mind small, keep me from being brave, keep me in a state of cowardice. Violence is always an easy answer. It's a failure of imagination. And so I see the frustration that arises in me. And I think that's different than self-defense and protection. So I want to say that I'm a big believer in knowing how to defend yourself. I know how to use firearms. I know how to use knives. I've taken martial arts. I believe it's actually important, because if it's actually done in a kind of correct way, you don't have to actually ever use it. And I also believe in protection. I think that this is one of the things I like about the Tibetan Buddhist system, and particularly the Shambhala and other Tibetan systems, is this idea of having protectors of the land, or dralas as we call them. You have ancestors of the, who are protectors, but also training and protecting the Sangha, and learning how to do that through means that aren't overtly violent, but that are about holding space and also being able to intervene if something happens. That's very real. I appreciate that. I'm not a pacifist. But there are very few occasions that cause for me to have to use those skills. There are other skills that I can use beforehand. But knowing that creates a confidence in oneself. I remember one day when I was in taking a karate class, I was in training in Oyama karate. And, we're sparring, and I'm sparring with this older student who's been practicing longer than me, this guy, bigger than me, whatever. And they were supposed to be nice to the newer students, and this guy gave me a punch and a kick. And I was like, whoa. But then there was something about being able to take a punch and be able to take a punch to the body and a kick to the body from like a 215-pound man that actually gave me some confidence. It's like, oh, my body can withstand that. and then be able to deliver a punch and a kick. So that actually creates a kind of confidence, martial arts and boxing and those kinds of things, that's valuable. And learning how to hold yourself and learning what the body can do. And of course it hurts, but it's that's part of it too, having a wide array of skills, but that you don't necessarily have to use, But I don't carry a gun with me because I would probably use it. So I have to know myself too. Now I'm living in an open carry state, and I'm like, no, that's not, no, because, then the opportunities present themselves. So for me, that's not something I choose not to do. But I do feel it's important to, I had learned to shoot a gun when I was young from my grandfather. And then, going to the firing range and learning how to feel comfortable with that tool and that weapon. Like, oh, this is powerful. This is not a toy. It's not a game. This is real. Seeing what a rifle bullet really looks like from an AR-15. They are about the length of a human finger, of an adult finger. So that's a very serious weapon. It's very, very serious if you choose to use that on someone or something. That also kind of knowledge transforms how I think about gun violence, how I think about mass shootings, how I think about interpersonal shootings, and that we have such access to such powerful weapons without the training or the mind training is very interesting. It's no wonder there's so much gun violence, because it's such a reactive. When you have that kind of tool in your possession, and it can easily feel like real power, rather than a tool you might use when necessary. It can easily just be a substitute for your own kind of power. So these are complex conversations, and I think they sometimes get shut down because we choose a side of there's some kind of political boilerplate, and nothing can replace direct experience, and having a kind of direct experience that then begins to inform direct experience that is informed by sort of ongoing contemplation. That it's okay to change your mind, it's okay to rethink things, but not just, oh, that person and I agree on something, so whatever they say about it, I agree with them about it. And sometimes that causes controversy. Sometimes people don't like it. People don't like hearing a Buddhist talk about guns. But at the same time, we live in a time when that kind of violence is so, it's so frequent. It ruins lives, So, it's an ongoing process for me. I'm really every day learning how to live my life and be wow, and look back a little bit and be like, oh, okay, that was pretty good. Or, this is an area that really needs some serious examination and then some improvement, some action at some point, and I need some help, and so those are the kind of things I think about, and it's really not about, perfectionism is a kind of form of laziness, because we're never going to reach, we're not supposed to. Nothing. That's what makes things beautiful, is they're imperfect and they do weird things, when trees grow in weird ways, or I don't know, I watch a lot of animal videos, when a cat gets stuck in blinders, that blinds or whatever, that's what makes things awesome. When people and animals and plants and things do weird things, that's the beauty. Perfectionism is so violent, it's so stiff, and it's so rigid. And yet I'm totally have the infection, you know what I mean? And cleaning furiously for, of course, making it hospitable, but, also having some relaxation in the forms. having some relaxation about what I do and not being so rigid if something goes wrong, because something always goes wrong. That's the way of the world. And if I'm inflexible, then I can't enjoy life. I can't enjoy, our communing together because I'm worried about this or that, But when I can just relax, make the container as habitable as possible, and then just relax with whatever arises, situations usually turn out pretty cool. It's pretty decent. It's usually actually better than I could have imagined, rather than the worry and the clenched fist and then every irritation is like a dagger, so yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. Do you have a talk? You have a Dharma talk?
I don't know.
Okay.
There is
Well, you've
there
been very
is one,
generous.
but I'm not running it.
Okay.
Am I? No. No. I'm not on tonight.
Okay. Well, I do want to be respectful of your time, but I'd love to ask you one more
Sure.
question, which is about the sci-fi, because I'm in a huge Octavia Butler cave right now.
Well, good.
And you were just talking about sort of the need for us to imagine,
Yes.
outside of the systems that we're in order to affect
Oh,
change.
yes.
So I wonder if the sci-fi world has given
Oh,
you...
so much.
Yeah.
So I have a to-go bag. It's actually not here with me in Atlanta. It's in New York. And people are like, really? And I'm like, I read Parable of the Sower many times, of course. Of course I have to. Drala here, she even has, I have things for her. So I have seeds, and I have, I did a training with the Army, whatever, emergency training. So I have all the things, water, dry water, and iodine, and knives, and, compasses, and plus I love, love camping and things like that. But I do think, yes, science fiction, I always have been, I've always loved science fiction and speculative fiction, fantasy. And I think the imagination, not just sort of the technology and spaceships, but, I was a huge Star Trek fan growing up. I was too young to watch the original Star Trek, but I used to watch it in reruns. And it was a show, actually, my mom, she passed away in 2013, but we used to watch it together. She had a crush on William Shatner. I don't understand why, but whatever. I was like, okay. And I remember the kind of lessons, the pedagogy of the early Gene Roddenberry's original Star Trek, and the exploration sort of without colonization aspect that I didn't really think of till later. But also like the encounters with different societies and cultures, and how complex that could be. And I think that science fiction, speculative fiction, the imagination, it's always a commentary on the moment that also can possibly help us to think about what our future could be. It doesn't have to be inevitable. What's hard sometimes about science fiction is that sometimes I'll be watching a show or a movie and I'm like, wow, the same old patriarchal, racist, homophobic, transphobic, everything's still here, except there's just spaceships, or it's dystopian, so that's sometimes interesting to think about, the lack of imagination in imaginative realms. But I think I think about the meeting actually now between science and science fiction as it's become more palatable and acceptable to say, obviously, there's life elsewhere. As there are multiple universes, there are parallel this is now hard science facts for this, the science nerds. There's parallel universes. There's so many what was it? I have a thing somewhere. I think there's 930 planets that in our galaxy or something, in different sizes. Some of them are so huge and ever growing, and time moves differently, and all this stuff. And I'm like, okay, so this is beyond what our minds can even conceive. And then there's that also great thing where it's maybe we're a simulation, which I love thinking about that. And then it also comes back in a way to Buddhism, because it's thinking about the relationship between consciousness and mind and energy as traveling, part of some kind of continuum that isn't made or destroyed. And that fact that we're this really interesting combination of the elements on this planet and then the same elements as the stars. So it's like, So it's like where science fiction and science meet as we get more technology to explore that. There's sort of blurring those lines, which I really, really like. There was this joke someone told on Twitter a while ago about, they were like, what if Adam and Eve were actually on Mars, and then they fucked up that planet, and then they were ejected to Earth, and someone's like, wait a minute. So it was this really interesting, just thinking about like how science fiction mixes with our own mythologies of our origin of our species, and Mars is a planet that has life on it, and probably had some more life than it has now because there's water, And so these things are really interesting to contemplate and to think about the vastness of our planet, of our galaxy and universe and Milky Way. And maybe it won't just be the rich people going off to colonize Mars and leaving us on a trash heap, or maybe that'll happen and we can create a different kind of society, So I do think about the imagination, not so much. I mean, I love, graphic novels. I teach classes on as in the spring here at Emory, I'll be teaching a class on race, gender, and science fiction. Cool. So I love teaching this stuff. I love thinking about it. But more than anything, I love the imagination, tapping into the imagination and human potential, which we are nowhere near reaching. And I heard a Buddhist teacher talking this past week about really having to upgrade our operating system because we're on a really ancient operating system that's fight, flight, or freeze. And it's just so limiting in terms of then how we think about even all these problems we were talking about or all these potentials we were talking about because we're still in that reptile brain. And part of meditation can really actually help us expand past that and also because the world is moving so fast, we're encountering so many situations that call for fight, flight, or freeze. We're not also capable of handling that many encounters. It's like you used to have 1 or 2 a week or something when you saw a saber-toothed tiger or whatever, or woolly mammoth, and now it's all the time. Almost getting hit by a car, get on a plane, It's too much, So seeing, vicariously, I'm seeing, hearing about other traumas, thinking about, climate change and, not the really destruction of the earth so much as the destruction of humanity, and probably take some other mammals and reptiles and insects with us. But the earth, unless we literally blow her up, will be fine. It's really us, It's like, dinosaurs were a lot more resilient than we were, and they're not here anymore. So that can kind of cause, But when we think about, but actually other ways are possible, other ways of being are possible, that's part of what getting quiet is about. Because otherwise we're just in habits. Those grooves are so well worn. It takes a while and it's like they're so well worn, they're paved, they're so fast, we just speed. So it's like making new neural pathways individually and collectively is like using a spoon, to dig the dirt. But we can actually make new connections. So that's really science fiction, the imagination and what people imagine is possible, what beings we could possibly encounter in our lifetime, what transformative ways we could be that aren't fascist or horrible, but that are expansive. It's, if I have a religion, it's probably science fiction. You know what I mean? Because it's the imagination and its possibility and it's a refuge from habits of destruction. So, thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
thank y'all so much for joining us again today. I'm so grateful for your ears and hearts and minds. If you want to find Dr. Smalls online, you can go to shanteparadigm.com, and you can also find me, marajames.com, and Mara James on Instagram. I want to share one last thing before we go, a quick teaching that's become a really sweet practice in my life. A friend shared this with me. He is a Buddhist, but had really been incorporating this in part of his recovery process in AA. You could call it a metta or a mantra. It's 3 simple lines, and he had originally shared this with me as a way to call in and practice forgiveness for people in my life that I was having a really hard time accessing forgiveness around. And I have to say, one of the beautiful things about a discipline is that it can short circuit the habitual thought processes that cut us off from our emotions and our bodies. And so a lot of the first times that I was doing this practice for a specific person, I felt like a total faker. Just like, I'm just saying words, but I don't actually mean what I'm saying. And then so sweetly, that somehow unfolded over time to become authentic and rooted in my body and in real meaning for me. And a really nice place to start with this can actually be practicing it for yourself, because I've found that being able to speak these words for myself and really mean them has often been some of the most challenging and can be a keyhole that opens it up for all beings. So I'm going to say it once using myself, and then I'm going to say it again for all beings. And if you want to try this practice, I'd even suggest doing 5 minutes a day, repeating this. You can do it at the end of a meditation, even if you'd like. So it goes like this. May I be happy. May I be free from suffering. May I be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be happy. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. I love you. I hope you're out there in the magic, seeing and feeling it inside of you and all around. Let's hang again soon.
Love will shine on you one day.
This old world goes around and around. Sometimes this world can get you down. Just don't give up. Don't dismay. What goes around comes around, they say. And if the sun should fail to shine, dreams are the sunshine of the mind. Hold on
To your dreams.
yeah. Dreams are the wings of the mind. You can fly anytime you like. Yeah.
Life will smile on you one day. Children, hold on.
Whoa, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Let love be the light to show the way.
Step by step, straight ahead. Though the road be hard to tread, yeah. What you get is what you do, and you'll find out that love is truly stronger than hate. All you need is your faith in your dreams. Gonna show you the way. Gonna show you the way.
Let love be the light to show the way. And love will shine on you one day.
Well,
Children, hold on to your dreams. Believe in love. Let love be the light to show the way.
hold on, yeah,
Life
yeah.
will smile
y'all. Hold on
to your dreams.
Believe in love. Let love be the light to show the way. Let it show you the way. Let it show you the
Love
way.
will shine on you
Yeah.
one day. Children, hold on. Believe in love. Love be the light to show the way.
Yeah.
And
Dreams are the wings of the mind. You can fly anytime you like. Well,
believe in love. Love will shine on you one day.
but you know, this world is very cold. You know, it don't make no difference whether you're young or old. Hold on, it's so unfair. Unless somebody really believes, I mean, to have somebody there to care. I'm talking about through the hard times and the bad times. Sharing your dreams, your thoughts, your heart, your mind.
Children, hold on to your dreams.
Believe in love. Let
Love be the light to show the way.
yeah, let it show you the way. Let it show you
Love
the way.
will shine on you one day. Children, hold on to your dreams.
Hold on.
Believe in love. Love be the light to show the way.
Dreams are the wings of the mind. You can fly anytime you like. Yeah.
Believe in
Love.
love be the light.
Be the light to show the way. Ha. Let it show you the way. Let it show you the
Life
way.
will shine
Yeah.
on you one day.
Whoa.
Children, hold on to your dreams.
To your dreams.
Believe in
Love.
love be the light to show the
Show the way. Let it show ya. Let it show ya.
Life
Let it show
will
ya. Let it show
shine
ya.
on you one
Let it show ya.
Children, hold
Hang on
on to your dreams.
to your dreams.
Believe in
Love.
love be the light to show the way.
Hold on, hey,
Love will shine on you one day.
Yeah. You know, sometimes the obstacles in life can really knock you down. Yeah. And life will really make you feel that don't nobody give a damn. I know it's hard. And it's cold and unfair. But if you keep one thing in your mind, and that thing is that whatever you do, you can make it. And just trust in yourself and hold on to your dreams, because your dreams are the future of this world. Let it show you. Let it show you the way, yeah.
Children, hold on